I'm Dr. Lisa Tuckman. I'm the Chief of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine, and I am so pleased to welcome you this morning to the annual Silver Lecture. The Silver Lecture is sponsored by donations made by Dr. Silver's patients for the purpose of disseminating information on clinical and research updates in the field of eating disorders. Dr. Silver did his pediatric residency at the Thomas Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia and his fellowship in adolescent and young adult medicine here at Children's in 1969. In just a couple of weeks, on Wednesday, May 29th, we will be celebrating the 50-year anniversary of when Dr. Silver first came to Children's as a fellow in adolescent medicine for the Lichen Lecture. Dr. Silver will be the keynote speaker, and he will be accompanied by Dr. Silver, and Dr. Silver, his 3 children as panelists, who will also be a really very special grand round presentation. We hope you'll be able to join us for that, as well as the celebration later that day with Dr. Silver. Dr. Silver joined the Division of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine here in 1973. He is a GW tenured professor of pediatrics. In his distinguished career, he's edited several textbooks and published more than 200 articles. He's the medical director of the Donald Delaney Eating Disorder Program in the Division of Adolescent Medicine. And we are so very proud of the multidisciplinary team that has provided these services at Children's for several decades. I'd like to invite Dr. Silver up to introduce this morning's distinguished Silver Lecturer.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Richard Kripke, who is the Elizabeth McAnany Professor of Pediatrics at Strong University Golisano Children's Hospital in Rochester, New York. Dr. Kripke is also the director of the Children and Adolescent Eating Disorder Program there, and his professional focus for the last 30 years has been on pediatric eating disorders, and he has numerous publications and articles on the subject. He has also been a leader in adolescent medicine. He has been president of the Society of Adolescent Medicine and Health. And he has been awarded numerous honors, including giving here about a decade ago the Rixey Lecture. So it's the first time that we have a speaker that has been a Rixey Lecturer and a Silver Lecturer, and we're so happy to have him back. He's going to give us now a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Tomas. It's wonderful to be here. Let me go back. It really is wonderful to be here again, to see everyone. And what I really hope to be able to do today is to kind of have a little bit maybe of a different perspective on eating disorders. As I say here, I have no conflict of interest. This is Rochester, New York, those of you who've never seen it. We have the only river that flows north, that's east of the Rocky Mountains. Genesee River actually flows north. What we're looking at right there in the foreground is kind of the university, and then just to the right of that would be the medical campus, but I have no conflict of interest in this presentation. So what I'd like to do today is to have us kind of walk away today, being able to apply 3 features of the biopsychosocial approach to patient care and evaluation of treatment of restrictive anorexia nervosa, and really kind of list transformative features of puberty, identity, autonomy, and brain maturation in adolescence that can actually be linked to the emergence of restrictive anorexia nervosa. And then finally, be able to frame restrictive anorexia nervosa as a dysfunctional developmental, not primarily mental condition with serious biological, psychological, and social effects. So first of all, I'd like to do, we'll have it kind of settling in, because people have been coming from lots of different kinds of places, and I think it's good to kind of start a day, especially with presentations, just by settling in. We want to talk about the DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistic Manual 5 criteria, with the key points being no judgment and no numbers, and I was pleased to be involved in that. The biopsychosocial approach to patient care overall by George Engel. But then also touch out slightly on normal adolescent growth and development issues related to James Tanner and Eric Erickson, Carol Gilligan, Jean Piaget, Jay Gein, and others, kind of putting what do we know about normal adolescent development. But then to frame restrictive anorexia nervosa as a developmental disorder related to adolescence, the process of going from childhood to adulthood, child to adult, girl to woman, boy to man, and not solely as a mental illness. And this is really something that Tom Insel, who was the head of the National Institute for Mental Health, kind of pointed out several years ago, that it really brain circuitry explains a lot more than putting it purely in the context of a psychiatric illness. And then I want to have time for discussion. I understand that we're linked with other remote communities. It's wonderful to be able to reach outside of just the DC area. So I just like folks to kind of settle in, and if you can just kind of focus on your breathing, take a few deep breaths, and as you breathe out, if you'd like to allow your eyes to gradually drift downward, just wonder what comes into your mind's eye when I say the word anorexia nervosa. Because I think what we come in with, that kind of a preconceived notion, may actually, hopefully, maybe you'll leave here with a little bit of a different notion, what we're talking about. So a tale of two cities. So I trained in Philadelphia at St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, and in June of 1979, I'm finishing my chief residency. And I'm going on chief resident rounds, and there's a 15-year-old female with restrictive anorexia nervosa admitted to the GI service with a psychiatry consult. She's in a private room for evaluation of abdominal discomfort with eating. Now, this old St. Christopher's Hospital was built in 1923, so it was mostly 2-, 4-, and 6-bed wards back in the day. And single rooms are mostly for kids with tuberculosis and other infectious diseases. And so I'm going on rounds, and I say, okay, well, let's go see this patient. The door is closed, but it's a single room. And had my hand on the door, and I knocked on the door, had my hand on the doorknob, and I said, so let's go in. And the residents and the medical says, oh, you can't go in there. And why not? Oh, she has anorexia nervosa. And because in 4 years of residency, 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, 1 year chief residency, I'd never heard the words anorexia nervosa put together. My question was, is she contagious? And they, of course, said, no. Well, what is it? Well, it's a psychiatric illness. And you can't go in there because these patients lie and they're manipulative and there's a lot of family pathology. And I said, well, why is she on the GI service if she's got a psychiatric illness? Well, because she's got this abdominal pain and she's not eating, whether I want to make sure there's not something wrong with her stomach. Okay, so I just walked away. 2 weeks later, I'm starting my fellowship in adolescent medicine in Rochester, and one of the first patients I get is a 15-year-old female with restrictive anorexia nervosa admitted to the adolescent medicine service with psychiatry co-management, very different kind of a thing, for weight restoration. The problem is I'm a brand new fellow. Actually, when I had hair down to here, I was on service, and I didn't have a clue about what to do. And I think in many ways, not having a clue was the best thing for me. I came in as a total tabula rasa, blank slate. But so being an academic fellow, I said, well, I need to start reading up on this. Well, Salvador Minuchin had written the book, Psychosomatic Families, Anorexia Nervosa in Context, in 1978. Actually, he did this work at the Child Guidance Clinic in Philadelphia. I said, oh, great. So this guy will tell me what's going on. And so what were the key features of psychosomatic families in this book? Well, the individuals in these families have poorly formed identities. And the boundaries between individuals are crossed, blurred, or non-existent. They have enmeshed relationships. The patient is manipulative, deceitful, and involved in splitting. The mother is overprotective and controlling. The father is emotionally distant and uninvolved. There's conflict avoidant interactions. The family cannot resolve conflict. They just avoid interactions like that. There's these triangulated alliances and power struggles. And there's a homeostatic balance provided by the illness. So the illness actually helps the family stay together. So I found that kind of curious. And this is kind of the beginning of the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. I want to kind of go through the evolution of the DSM. So you see at the very top, DSM-2 was about this thick. In 1979, it was a DSM-2 when things were divided into psychosis or neurosis. And there wasn't a whole lot of talking about eating disorders as a behavioral problem. But we see we went to DSM-3, 3R, 4, and 4 and for the text revision, and then DSM-5, which is now the Arabic number. Just want to kind of go through that to see how things kind of changed over time, and I'm not sure I exactly know why, but I don't think it was a good thing the way things changed. So DSM-3 in 1980, these are the criteria. There's an intense fear of becoming obese. Okay. Disturbance of the body image, claiming to feel fat even when emaciated. If a patient comes in and they say, I'm depressed, do we say, well, she claims to be depressed? So why the word claiming? Well, because she can't be trusted. Significant weight loss, and there was a lot of weight loss, less than 75%. Refusal to maintain a minimal normal weight. Well, what does refusal mean? Well, she's oppositional, she's defiant, she's not going to do what you tell her to, she's not going to be a good patient. Wow. And cannot be accounted for by known physical disorder. Well, there's lots of things we don't know. But this was kind of the hubris of things in 1980. And in 1983, we can see here in the Journal of Adolescent, of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, I have highlighted here, John Showalter was the head of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Yale, very well known. And I talked to him about this, so this is not, I'm not disclosing anything behind closed doors. What we have here in the introduction to a special section on this, I've highlighted, this was John's quote. As one who is often asked to help this position, I know that the referral of an eating disorder patient to a colleague is not usually considered to be a friendly act. So when I said to John, I said, John, this is kind of, because I gave a visiting talk at Yale, I said, John, that's kind of pejorative. He just thought it was funny. Well, and then in the context of that same section, he and Walter Anion, the head of adolescent medicine at Yale, wrote this comprehensive approach to anorexia nervosa, talking about the inpatient management of anorexia nervosa. And here's the inpatient adolescent medicine treatment team. And I've highlighted here the role of the nurse. So it starts out with the pediatrician, et cetera. The patient's nurse provides regular care, but does not become involved in discussing the patient's illness or possible solutions to it. The patient is encouraged to refer these aspects of care to the child psychiatrist, who is generally a child and adolescent fellow, who often didn't have much contact with patients with anorexia nervosa, and who knows more about what patients need than nurses. How many people in the audience here are nurses? Okay, good. Because I think we need to really kind of get back to the fact that nurses have a lot of important roles in patients. Anyway, but this was kind of what I was learning. So these kids, this is not what I was used to. And well, the reason I had to be very suspicious is because kids have eating disorders because of parenting failure, and we need to do a parentectomy. Like parents are a malignant force. We have to remove the kid from the family. That was kind of the dominant theme that I'm coming into in 1983, and I'm saying, boy, this just doesn't make sense. And then I start really getting concerned. DSM-3R, refusal comes to the top of the list. We changed the weight criteria. Refusal to maintain a minimum normal weight for height. Intense fear of becoming fat. Disturbance, and again, claims to feel fat. Why is the word claims there? And why is the quotes feel fat in quotes? Well, and obviously the problem is the body is not too fat because she's obviously underweight. These are the real words that were used. Wow. Maybe there's a reason we can't connect with patients. And so if you ever can read anything by Eric Cassell, he's just absolutely wonderful. I know Tomas is very interested in the issue of suffering, and he's written, I think, a wonderful book about the nature of suffering and the goals of medicine. And what he says is spoken language is the most important diagnostic and therapeutic tool in medicine. We must be as precise with it as a surgeon with a scalpel. And so just to kind of bring along, in 2012, there was a worldwide charter on action for eating disorders. And at the International Conference on Eating Disorders, I got up and made the comment, why do we have the word in recognition that eating disorders, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and related disorders are serious mental health disorders? Why do we call it a mental health disorder? Why is this an illness? Does it give us any kind of advantage calling it a mental illness? And obviously, I'm only a pediatrician, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But it was real interesting to kind of come up against this kind of an action. So this is where I was. These are the kind of issues I was dealing with. And so in 2007, I was asked to be on the DSM-5 eating disorder work group. And I'm sitting not too far from here. I'm sitting in Arlington, and with a bunch of the world's leaders in eating disorders. And I said, Cripey, you don't belong here. You're a fraud. These people are really leaders. I mean, they were presidents of adolescent, really big leading researchers, et cetera. But I said, no, you need to stay here because in the back of my mind, you need to speak on behalf of patients and parents. And so at this meeting, I said, so why is refusal the first word of the first criterion for restrictive anorexia nervosa in DSM-4? And why is that? And it was kind of like, well, we don't know. And I pointed out that, I think the difficulty is it's pejorative, it's judgmental, it reveals negative countertransference related to opposition, defiance, resistance, disobedience, and confrontation. They said, well, yeah, so where would you recommend? I said, well, some word that's not pejorative, judgmental, et cetera. So they said, okay, well, we agree. And then I was on a roll, so I said, now, what is this nonsense of an ideal body weight? There's this bright line, and that bright line threshold, and it's thought to be a meaningful clinical determinant. How and why? And they said, well, what would you suggest? And I sucked the air out of the room. I said, do away with numbers. And the researchers, well, wait a minute, how are we going to know if somebody's below or above a threshold? I said, as long as you realize that threshold is totally irrelevant with respect to the big picture. And also, DSM-5 is a clinical criterion. They said, well, okay. And I also pointed out, being a liberal arts student at LaSalle College in Philadelphia, and besides, in the criteria, it's E period, G period, which stands for exempli gratia, for example. It was not I-E, it S, that is. So what was given in the criteria was just an example, but it was used as a bright line. So and I said, basically, the other problem is body weight can be falsified. Sure, anybody who's worked with patients with eating disorders know what it's like when somebody's weight is up 3 pounds because they falsify their weight and stuff. So what we ended up with in the DSM-5 was restriction of energy intake relative to requirements, leading to a significantly low body weight in the context of age, sex, developmental trajectory, and physical health. I thought that was a big improvement. Intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, or persistent behavior that interferes with weight gain, even though at a significantly low weight, with significantly no weight not defined as a number. And then a disturbance in the way in which one's body weight or shape is experienced due to with an undue influence of body weight, shape, or self-perception, or persistent lack of recognition of the seriousness of low body weight. So these are the 3 main criteria that I think really get much more to the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about restrictive anorexia nervosa. We also had to specify severity. That's the DSM-5. All conditions had to have, you had to go talk about severity. And so the minimum level of severity is based for adults on current body mass index, and for children and adolescents on BMI percentile. However, the level of severity may be increased to reflect any kind of clinical symptoms, degree of functional disability, and the need for supervision. So I basically find numbers pretty useless compared to the big picture. It can be part of it, but it's much more the whole big picture that comes together. And so this brings us to the biopsychosocial model that was described by George Engel and John Romano at the University of Rochester. And what we see here is this so-called double helix, and we see at the very bottom some atomic particles with the arrows going back and forth all the way up to the person and their experience and behavior, to Pearson's families, etc. And this is the picture of George. He was just a wonderful wonderful man, and I was actually able to study under him before he eventually died. But a medical student we had pointed out, the biopsychosocial model, the first 6 letters of the word biopsychosocial model spell biopsy. So we really have to be able to pay attention to what are the medical complications, what are the medical issues related to various kinds of behaviors, but also to integrate it with the psychosocial issues. And the thing that really kind of drove George crazy was when people would hyphenate bio-psycho-social. So no, you have to keep putting it back together, and it's back and forth and integrate. So the biopsychosocial approach, the person who's really written about this, probably the most from the University of Rochester, is one of my colleagues named Ron Epstein. He's written a book called Attending, which is really a wonderful book about actually being a physician who actually is attentive to what the patient needs. And so I think the clinical applications here that have relevance with respect to eating disorders is, first of all, clinician self-awareness. So that whole issue of countertransference, it's really important to be aware of kind of how you're feeling about in interacting with the patient. this active cultivation of mutual trust, meaning you trust the patient and the patient trusts. It's back and forth. And so when I first see a patient with anorexia nervosa, I say, I trust you, but I don't trust your eating disorder as far as I can throw it. Because your eating disorder makes you do dishonest things. It makes you hide food. It makes you throw food out. It makes you tell your mother, yeah, I had breakfast when you didn't. That's not in your nature. That's an eating disorder that's actually working against your nature. So I think that whole issue of mutual trust is important. And a lot of people, again, they come in where you can't, these individuals are highly manipulative and split, et cetera. And the thing I really like to get back to is a quote that Steve Levenkron talked about. And he had a patient who was he was famous for some of the people he treated. And he went to see a patient in a hospital in Westchester, New York. And he came in and the woman said, you treat me differently than the people here. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, the people here don't trust me. And she used all the words, they split, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, well, how am I different? And she said, well, you believe me. And I love this phrase, and I say this to my patients. I reserve the right to believe you even when you're lying to me. I'm not going to try to figure out if you're lying or not. I'm assuming you're telling me the truth because I know in your nature you're an honest person, and it's going to drive you crazy if you lie to me all the time. And it's real interesting how I don't have to be the people to figure out, I don't have to be the person to figure out, is she telling the truth or not? I just assume you're telling the truth. And it's interesting how that really kind of does help in mutual trust. Again, empathic curiosity in relationship with the patient. This gets back to the mindfulness issue. So when I see a patient, I'll say, when I give you when you leave here and we've circled the diagnosis, I'm going to circle a number of different things. But that doesn't tell me anything about you. I need to know about you as a person. And so coming in with kind of a beginner's mind, the whole idea of mindfulness is what the curiosity is. Tell me about you. And not so much, I'm going to focus on your eating disorder. Tell me about you as a person who maybe has an eating disorder. So again, that's empathic curiosity. Again, self-calibration to reduce bias. So when we come in with a certain preconceived notion, step back and say, wait a minute, how did I come to this conclusion? Because do I really have data to support that? And I love this one, educating emotions to assist in diagnosis and forming therapeutic relationships. So kind of being aware of where you're coming from, but being aware of how you're feeling about certain kinds of things. Using informed intuition, and then communicating clinical evidence to foster dialogue, not just the application of protocols. So when I have a patient who says, I'm only eating so many calories a day, but their weight is stable, or they say they're eating a whole lot and their weight is dropping, I'll just say, something's not jiving up. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense to me. So kind of being able to, again, form a dialogue with patients. So let's talk a little bit about normal adolescent growth and development, because I think this is the frame in which those of us in adolescent medicine put everything in the context of what's normal adolescent growth and development like. And I think especially with respect to the concept of restrictive anorexia nervosa, it's important because one of the major things is puberty, girl to woman, boy to man. Well, talk about the transformative changes. So between the age of 10, you take a 50th percentile girl growing along the 50th percentile growth rate. Between the ages of 10 and 14, what's the average amount of weight gain? How many pounds does the average 10-year-old gain, she's on the 50th percentile, gain between age 10 and age 14? Somebody cheats. Yeah, it's 40 pounds. Okay, that's a lot of weight. And so talking about changing from girl to woman, it's transformative. And I think if we just, it's no big deal. It's a big deal also for boy to man. So I think puberty is a very important part that gets a lot of things going with respect to the initiation of restrictive anorexia nervosa. Identity. Eric Erickson talks about identity is the major thing of going from child to adult. Do you leave adolescence with a stable sense of self, or do you leave it without any sense of self? And for many people with restrictive anorexia nervosa, their thinness, their numbers on a scale, their size of their clothes, that helps define who they are and how they feel about themselves. Now, it's a narrow range, but it's something that does provide a sense of, it does provide kind of an anchor. And so if your anchor in your sense of self is based on numbers on a scale, you can see how that's going to be fairly limiting. But I think the whole issue of identity is crucial to think about who you are, et cetera. And I remember I had a patient who, at 18 years of age, I had picked up when she was 15 years of age, because the person who was taking care of her from 12 to 15, she started her anorexia nervosa with her very first menstrual period at age 12, basically stopped the world and I get off. And I picked her up at age 15. At age 18, I had this conversation. You know, you've had an eating disorder for the last 6 years, and you're 18 years old now, and you've graduated from high school, and you're doing lots of interesting things. She was at community college. She was also did window dressing at a back when we had department stores downtown. And she said, you know, when I was 12, anorexia nervosa was what I did. Now it's who I am. And I just said, you know, that sends chills up and down my spine. If your concept of self, if your identity, and going from childhood to adulthood, one of the major issues is you come up with a stable sense of adult identity, and that sense of adult identity is based on numbers on the scale of physical appearance or things like that. So that's limiting, and it makes me sad that you're limiting yourself, because I can see so many other kinds of things. So that whole issue of identity becomes very important. Autonomy, childhood to adulthood. We always talk about restrictive anorexia, but it's about control. Well, it's about control in a way that's pretty dysfunctional, but it does give a sense of mastery when you can see the numbers on the scale go down. And I think that's an important thing to talk about. Again, that's part of normal adolescent development, is the sense of autonomy that comes with significant ability to maintain weight or lose weight. And then brain maturation. And the stuff we're learning with respect to brain maturation is just exploding our knowledge of things. So we know that early on, the limbic system tends to be prominent, but it goes to an integrated network with the frontal and prefrontal lobe as individuals mature. And what is so fascinating to me, having been in this business for 40 years, not quite as long as Tomas, for 50 years, but is how you can see things. The brain, the thinking process of a 16-year-old is different than a 14-year-old, and it's different than an 18-year-old. And so the degree that we can say, you know, your brain is going to continue to develop. And I see some medical students, and I love talking to medical students, and I said, you know, how many people here are not yet 25 years of age? And you see a lot of hands go up. I said, good news, your brain is still developing. My brain is undeveloping, but, you know, you're still going. And so what we're learning about the whole issue of brain maturation and identity and autonomy and puberty, you put those things together, and I think it helps us understand a lot about the emergence of anorexia nervosa. And it's interesting. People say, well, you know, what about a patient who's 40 years old? You know, when I talk to 40-year-olds who have anorexia nervosa, I said, tell me when this all started. It was in childhood. Oh, my body image has been rotten. So I think, again, the more we can talk about this as a developmental disorder, which has a lot of underpinnings of anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive, trauma, yes, but let's not just focus on what's wrong with a person. I think one of the major issues with respect to adolescent medicine is we really try to focus on what is someone's strengths, what are the positives. So again, I think you can see normal adolescent growth and development as a way in which restrictive anorexia nervosa may be very fertile soil to grow. So this is a picture that was drawn by a 14-year-old patient. She had to do a thing for school, kind of, you know, self-study. And what we see here is up on the, it may be a little bit difficult to see, but up on the upper left-hand corner here are books. The books are 5-minute exercise, secrets of staying thin, et cetera. You see a jump rope. This is not a jump rope for, you know, double dutch. This is a jump rope I have to exercise to burn all calories. The clock, 6 o'clock, it's always dinner time. Because they can get away with not eating breakfast because, oh, I have schoolwork to do. And then they get to school and, well, I don't have to eat lunch because I had a big breakfast. And then they get home for dinner. Well, I don't have to eat dinner because I had a good lunch. But dinner time is really the most difficult time. And what you see here is just beyond arm's reach: cookies, cakes, pie, candy, ice cream, the so-called forbidden foods. The fork is overturned. All you see is carrot and strawberry and some peas. And then the central feature of, you know, on the outside, she is Superwoman, and on the inside, she feels like an empty shell. And I asked her, why is it that on the upper right-hand corner, you're a skull, and on the lower left-hand corner, you're a skeleton, or superwoman. She's, well, it's because I'm always feeling different at different times. There's nothing that's stable, nothing that really holds steady. It's kind of always in flux. And so I think if that's the picture that a 14-year-old draws of having restrictive anorexia nervosa, that's pretty interesting. Right? And so the other issue is that we need to get back to the fact that there's a biological underpinning for this. So the biology of human starvation. So when in World War II, we had GIs coming back from the Pacific Rim. And any of you who haven't seen the movie Bridge Over the River Kwai, you got to get it. It's great. It's a wonderful book, wonderful movie. That was people on the Pacific Rim and then also people coming from concentration camps in Europe. And they came back to the United States and they died because they were overfed. Well, if a person comes back and emaciated, what do? Well, you get them, you want the whole apple pie? Sure. We'll put some ice cream on? Sure. You want some gravy on mashed potatoes? Absolutely. And people started realizing, man, we can't be having these people almost starve to death and then kill them when they come back. And so Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota and his group pulled together a group of 32 engineering majors at the University of Minnesota, and any of you who know Big Ten engineering majors, University of Michigan, Minnesota, et cetera, these are serious engineers. And you know that these guys are serious engineers because look at the number of pocket protectors. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and this guy has 2 pocket protectors. So these are real engineers. And what the reason this is so important is that what these men experience, they develop the thinking patterns, the behaviors, a lot of the things of anorexia nervosa, which means that a lot of what we're seeing in anorexia nervosa is not some psychiatric illness, it's the biological underpinning of starvation and what happens. And what was real interesting is of these 32, when this research was over, they did, 3 of them went on to be chefs. And so the thing that makes this interesting, in order to study how to refeed people once they're starved, what we had to do was they had to be starved. And so the eating disorder world is interested in what happened in those first 6 months of starvation, even though the research was basically how do we refeed people once you're starved. It's interesting how the eating disorder world is interested in the pre-research, everything that was happening prior to, and it's just a fascinating study. And actually, I'm a nerd when your wife gets you the 2-volume thing of the biology of human starvation in 1944. It cost her quite a bit. She had to go to some antiquarian place, but so I have that book. I have that 2-volume sitting on my shelf, and it's a fascinating stuff. Great science. Could never be reproduced now because of human investigation stuff, but it was great science. And again, these people, rather than going to war, they were conscientious objectors. So they actually thought they were helping, produce some science. But again, this could not pass human investigations committees now. And this is just a picture of these young guys, kind of lying out for some sun. And so again, we learned a lot about the biology of human starvation. A lot of what people with anorexia nervosa experience is really the experience of being malnourished, inadequate caloric intake. And so I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk, discussions and things, but there's two documents, that I really think is important to kind of help us anchor kind of what I'm talking about. And one is there's a pamphlet that the Feast put together is the Families Empowered and Supporting Treatment is a group. Actually, it's somewhat local here. I think it's in Alexandria, Virginia. But we did a number of pamphlets, booklets, and this one is called Puzzling Symptoms. I was pleased to be a part of this, the neurobiology of eating disorders. And so some of the key points that come out of this, and I think that underscores what I'm talking about with respect to developmental disorder, is that often a young person has certain traits since early childhood that had nothing to do with food that are early eating signs. Looking back, most families will remember that the patient had one or more of the following traits even as a young child: anxious, sensitive, obsessive, perfectionistic, impulsive, difficult to soothe. Okay. How many people in this room might have some of those features? And so I think when we start defining people in terms of what's wrong with them, there's a bit of a difficulty. Yeah. So that the foundational thing that tends to occur for almost all of these individuals is an underlying tendency towards anxiety. They worry, and that's kind of a trait. And guess what? It's a trait that is highly heritable. You know, so I love it when parents come in and say, geez, I don't know why she's so anxious. Well, you know, she got half of her genes from you and half of her genes from you, and you put them together and you got the toxic mix. Not to blame anybody, but, and then these personality traits may indicate differences in brain function that put young people at special risk of developing eating disorders. Not that you do anything about it, but just that you're aware that, okay, this might be a person who's really anxious and sensitive and may have difficulty soothe obsessive perfectionism. If they stop eating enough for their growth needs or activity level, their restricted eating can lead to dramatic changes in the brain. So these are things that we're starting to actually identify. Once started, it can be difficult for the young person to get back to normal without help. So once they start going down that weight loss path, the idea of eating can be really difficult. And the people for whom this is there's the most difficulty, and I think there's probably a reason why the vast majority of people who develop eating disorders are females. That the typical male response to this, you're talking to dads or brothers, why doesn't she just eat? And it's not that simple. And so I think that what we need to start to realize is that sometimes you can start going down that path and it's not easy to get things turned around. Because of the unique way the person's brain and body responds to limited nutrition, the longer they are malnourished, the harder it becomes to eat normally. So once they start going down that path, it becomes more and more difficult. And then you start getting tensions between an anxious patient and an anxious mother, and they have trouble kind of realizing, you know, how am I going to get things turned around? And you can see how things could escalate in a perfectly normal, otherwise perfectly normal underlying setting. And again, for some young people, a cycle of delaying meals, overeating, and purging also sets in. Recent work using brain imaging, cognitive testing, and studies of the brain nerve cell functioning to begin to identify some of the key brain key mechanisms, pathways, and chemical signals underlying eating disorders. So there's definitely different things related to kind of reward circuits and threat circuits. So individuals with eating disorders in a functional MRI, when they're shown people who don't have an eating disorder, you show them in a functional MRI a picture of, and this is my favorite, so a slice of pizza that has all the right stuff on it, you know, and you can just see the pepperoni maybe just curling a little bit and getting, and you can see the, and I'm already injecting dopamine into my central nervous system like nobody's business. And so that's a real something attractive. But you have those same kinds of things that would be scary foods for a person with an eating disorder, restricted anorexia nervosa, and they're in an fMRI, the parts of the brain that light up tend to be the threat centers. So imagine looking at something that we think, oh, that looks great, but for them, it's a threat. So there's a lot to do with kind of underlying brain mechanisms that we are just really starting now to understand. And then while individual pathways to development of eating disorder are many and may vary from person to person, the key similarities in thoughts and behaviors seen in eating disorder patients seem to indicate similar brain disorders. So no matter where you go talking to patients who have an eating disorder, the patterns are extremely kind of monotonous, which I think indicates that there's probably something organically going on in the brain. How big we feel not only depends on our physical senses, but also on our beliefs, memories, and emotions. That's a long-term kind of an issue. So when I was a kid, I was overweight, and I still kind of, there's still some things about me that, well, okay, maybe I could lose a bit of weight and things like that. So we embody a lot in ourselves that patients with eating disorders may carry that for some time. And it is possible this information may not be being processed accurately by the brain. In fact, some recent imaging work tends to show altered function of the parietal and related regions of the brain, which are known to regulate body perception. So this actually has to do with maybe some of the circuits in the brain, actually kind of the way you perceive yourself is different than the way people who don't have that kind of circuits. The brain, and this is, I think, the key positive point, the brain is constantly learning and changing. Restoring healthy eating weight, along with psychotherapy, skills building, and a supportive environment can help in eating disorder symptoms to improve or to go away. And while many underlying traits present since childhood, such as perfectionism and anxiety, may still exist after recovery, they are often manageable or respond to specific psychotherapy or drug treatments. And again, the earlier the intervention, the higher the chance of success, but there was always hope for successful recovery. Always hope for successful recovery. So this Gina at age 18, who said anorexia nervosa was what I did, Now it's who I am. She's now 56 years old. But in the last 2 years, she's moved out of her house. She now has a job. She has her own car. She got her own driver's license. She's making progress. And I saw her actually, we had a National Eating Disorders Awareness Week event, and she was there, and I didn't recognize her, She looks so much healthier. And so there's always hope for change, no matter how long somebody's been having symptoms. And that is absolutely an important thing to walk away with. Because I just got a call last night from a patient who's now 21 years old, got a call from the mother, and she's saying, she's not doing really well. She's kind of struggling. But she thinks she's never going to get better because she's had this for several years. Well, she's only 21 years old. Her brain still has lots of growth. And then some other kind of concepts I want to leave you with. Michael Strober and Craig Johnson in the International Journal of Eating Disorders a few years ago. And I love this. I mean, talk about a long title. The need for complex ideas in anorexia nervosa, why biology, environment, and psyche all matter, why therapists make mistakes, and why clinical benchmarks are needed for managing weight concern. So some of the key points are that anorexia nervosa is a brain disease. Patients behave strangely and say illogical things because their actions, perceptions, and utterances are irrational because they're brainy at that time. This is not a permanent kind of thing. The plasticity of the brain is so important to keep in mind. It's a genetic disorder, meaning that there does tend to be a tendency towards having an underlying issue of especially around anxiety. Features one thought to be part of its psychological realm are effects of its genetic underpinnings, having no unique significance. Methods to study brain biology are prone to overinterpretation. That's a very important thing. So a certain thing in the brain lights up, oh, that's the cause of the anorexia nervosa. No, but it's important to kind of start to piece things together. Because anorexia nervosa is a brain-based illness, family turmoil should be viewed only as a byproduct of the frustration the illness sows. Weight correction needs to take priority for these tendencies to resolve. Things said by patients about their relationships, family ones included, should not be taken too seriously. Now, that obviously is difficult if you're in the middle of a family who's dealing with these issues, but I think it is important to help the families realize this is part of the eating disorder and stuff that can change. And this is another important thing. Psychotherapy cannot and should not take place until the brain is mended by restoring weight to normal. I think we really have to focus on that. This particular patient, her weight was very low, and the mom said, well, she's been started on fluoxetine. I said, well, but the fluoxetine's not going to have any effect until she nourishes her brain. And so it's interesting how, well, start on medication. Well, food is her medicine. And I think that's sometimes a difficult thing to get across. Family-based motivational therapy is the only acceptable method for treating young patients. Not only are genes and environment correlated, the effects of each co-evolve and interact, and neither influence is deterministic. Again, and this is another really important point, brain circuitry is not fixed, but adapts functionally to the environment and then depends on it for its continuing expression. Neural circuits have plasticity and support, different, at times contrasting, motivational drives depending on the environment's emotional tone. And this was something that we saw. I can think of, I had a set of twins who came in to the hospital, and the two of them together weighed what one person would weigh, identical twins. And it was real interesting because what was happening at home, the parents were doing the best they could, and they were just kind of, but they came into the hospital and it was, okay, yeah, we're going to help you get done with these. And things started to get better, and they started to, and then we brought the parents, and we said, okay, here's what we're doing. You can kind of keep on with this. Parents went back home with the kids. The kids are doing great. They're both now going to college. Well, they've been accepted to Duquesne, which is good because from Buffalo, where they live, down to Pittsburgh, it's only about a 5-hour drive, but it's enough that they're not going to keep going back and forth. And when these kids initially got hospitalized, the consensus of the team who admitted us, oh, they're going to have to go to residential treatment facility for weeks and months on end. No, they could get things turned around in 20 days at the hospital because we really kind of focused on things. And so I think that whole issue of the environment, a structured environment that can be really supportive is really, really essential. And then finally, neurochemical changes brought on by stress, including exposure to adverse rearing environments, strengthen the encoding of memories for negative emotional events, and also reshape brain morphology, reasons linked to anxiety, fear, learning, and reward seeking. And likewise, when you can undo those kinds of things. Environmental stress mechanistically increases anxiety proneness by oversensitizing fear-generating structures in the limbic brain, amygdala nuclei, and disrupting prefrontal modulation of this region. And then conversely, rearing in, this is the key point, rearing in environments characterized by parental warmth can silence genes that otherwise promote anxiety, a finding that may possibly shed at least some light on why positive family relations have been linked to better short and long-term outcomes in adolescence. So I think that's kind of it's good that they ended up on a very positive note. And so kind of in summary, again, I want to make sure with these times to have some discussion. The Diagnostic Statistic Manual 5 criteria for restrictive anorexia nervosa are intentionally less stringent and pejorative, with no weight threshold, and severity is based on a thorough clinical assessment. Restrictive anorexia nervosa tends to emerge as an adaptive response to developmental processes of adolescence, puberty, identity, autonomy, and brain circuitry maturation. Dysfunctional brain circuitry, not family dynamics, accounts for much dysfunctional behavior in adolescent anorexia nervosa. And improvement in metabolism, circulation, and bone health depend on adequate nutrition. Again, back to the issue of food is medicine. And then, again, family-based treatment focused on strengths and intra and interpersonal connections really hold promise. So this was a drawing, and don't turn your head upside down. I did this talk, I had talk to people. Just, what do you see? This was a panel that a patient had drawn. So we asked patients before they leave the hospital, could you draw a panel for the next person? And this was a panel that I was looking at as I was looking at the patient's room. What do you see? What's that? It's upside, okay. But what do you see just looking at the way it is? You see a flower, but so people already, see, I'm not that good at doing that. I looked at this and I said, gee, that's a strange looking picture that she had put up on the wall. And so I went in to see her. And as I come out of the room, here's what the panel said. Where hope grows, miracles blossom. And you can see the outline of the face. Amazing young person who came with really bad restrictive anorexia nervosa, really bad. And she's now doing very well. She's a college student. This was when she was 16 years of age. And so I think that whole issue of hope is really important, especially if we can have hope that's informed by the facts that kind of we talked about. So this is our program, one of our program booklets, Adolescent Children's Hospital. And thank you. So I wanted to make sure we let some time to kind of have discussion. I especially want to make sure we can connect with the folks remotely. So that's it. So how do we know if there's, but what about remotely? I want to start with, oh, they'll call in, okay. I don't want to ignore the hinterlands. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. Going back to World War II, I remember having read that the children of Holocaust survivors, when they started to reach adolescence, had a much higher risk of anorexia nervosa. And I wondered whether, am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
And if so, how do you fit that into this model?
I think for some of it may have been, there's a certain kind of a survivor guilt that, remembering the stuff that they went through and the other folks who went through things that are even worse. I don't deserve to eat. I mean, that's one of the issues. Also, just the whole issue of stress and the fact that they're going through sense of coming to a sense of identity, autonomy in the context of your historical background can be really difficult. And the fact of the matter is, if losing weight gives you a sense of control, man, it's a powerful, powerful thing. And so I think that the way that most of us piece that all together is the fact that with respect to the issue of identity, survivor guilt, et cetera, that for a while controlling my weight and controlling what I eat is kind of gives me a sense of meaning. And I think the interesting thing that kind of alluding to this, there's a book that I recommend all of my patients to read, written by Viktor Frankl, F-R-A-N-K-L, The Man's Search for Meaning. And if I look at the outstanding feature of my patients with restrictive anorexia nervosa, they don't have meaning in their life, like the thing that would be meaningful for long-term adulthood. So I think it's an interesting question. I don't know that we have the answers, but that's kind of the best answer I have.
Thank you. Hi, Richard. It's good to have you here. Elizabeth Holm, and this was great. I mean, it was a wonderful presentation. I'm really glad that everyone here can hear this. I have been increasingly seeing people who come to me. I'm a nutritionist, who have developed anorexia kids, who were tracking on their 90th percentile, recommended by their pediatrician to lose weight, even though they maybe have always been at their 90th percentile, and then developed anorexia. And the other thing I'm seeing is an epidemic of eating disorders and really even developing anorexia at some local boarding schools. And I've come to the conclusion that with this boarding school, I'd like to recommend that they actually have a policy that when kids come, they cannot drop off the growth curve. But I think that is also often going to be contradicted by some of the pediatricians that see them tracking at a high weight. And so I feel like we're in this dilemma of this risk of obesity, childhood obesity, but then this risk of making these recommendations to lose weight in kids that, especially in this world of thinness, that we develop anorexia. And I just wondered if that's a conversation as a pediatrician you've had and how you think we should address that.
Excellent question. So I think the important thing is that I learned from Joan Flender, one of our primary care physicians. She said, first of all, you never make any comment about their weight or anything like that. Because it used to be when I was young, oh, look how big you're getting. That was a wonderful thing. You'd say how big you're getting to a preteen female, you mean I'm getting fat. And so what the recommendation is, don't make any comments about weight. Oh, here's your weight, here's your height. Good, okay, we're done, without making any kind of judgment about it. I think you're absolutely right, Elizabeth. There's a real difficulty because we have, I like to point out to patients that a dilemma is not a choice between good and bad. It's a choice between bad and worse. And obesity is public health problem number one. I don't think we have any good solutions for it. And I think that when people start talking about weight loss, rather than, I think one of the things we should be talking about is, what's your daily schedule like? And so what I kind of get back to, if we lived by the rules of our grandparents, we could probably be a lot healthier. What was our grandparents? You eat 3 square meals a day. You don't snack in between. You get 8 hours of sleep, and you go outside to play. I really think we could do a lot with both obesity and anorexia nervosa if we just kept to those 3 things. But what about people in the audience? Because I agree, it's a tough question.
And I guess my question is, is the pediatric discipline addressing this? Because I think pediatricians have been kind of taught to address obesity and recommend that kids do about it. I mean, I see it over and over and over again, and I feel like they're misinformed in some respects.
Yeah, so here's the book that I recommend, and it's now like you can get it by 75% off. I don't know why, but because it's a great book. It's called I'm Like, So, capital S, capital O, Fat, F-A-T, exclamation point, by Diane Newmark Steiner, Neumark hyphen, or dash hyphen, whatever, yeah. S-Z-T-A-I-N-E-R. I'm Like So Fat. And the subtext of this is helping young people grow in a weight-obsessed world. And I think what she tries to talk about is it's about balance. And one of the first questions I ask parents is, so, Mom, do you eat breakfast every day? What do we know about people who eat breakfast every day? They're less likely to be overweight. Now, is that the simple thing? But so I think talking about some of the typical behaviors that the whole family can do without singling out the kid. But I wish I had the answer to that question. Does anybody in the audience have the answer to that question? Yeah, in the back. Oh, there's an answer.
No answer, just another question. Really fascinating, great stuff. Can you talk a little bit about prevention? It seems like you have a sense of what the early life phenotype is like, what the at-risk population is like. Are there community-based or even population-based interventions that can do a lot to prevent this development of this disorder?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is important is to have individuals realize that self-esteem has very little to do with physical appearance, because I think we do have kind of this, and I find it so fascinating that a 20-year-old guy can go around with a beer belly, and it's okay because, well, I'm a 20-year-old, but there's kind of this principles of a woman has to look a certain kind of a way. So I think the issue of not judging a person's anything that's of value about a person on physical appearance. There's a thing called the Body Project. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Body Project. That's a wonderful kind of a thing that just talks about, for both boys and girls, kind of talking about what healthy growth and development is all about. What about, let me ask this question, in DC, what are the programs that are active now in the community with respect to prevention of eating disorders, both obesity and eating and anorexia nervosa, et cetera, through kind of daily patterns of healthy activity? Anybody?
Not much.
Right.
Yeah.
Rock recovery? Yeah, but you're right. In prevention, we need to do more in the way of prevention. And see, I consider prevention very early. I consider secondary prevention as important. So we get these kids early and we start to see where they're going down and their thinking patterns. So, and to the degree to which a person says that, in order for me to be popular, I need to look a certain kind of a way. The other thing that this may sound kind of strange, but the issue of bullying, I can't tell you the number of girls who come to me who said, because I was excluded. And it's not like I was excluded because of my physical appearance. I was just excluded from the social settings, really kind of with the beginning of my anorexia nervosa. It gave me a sense of self and purpose. So